Hello there, I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is the Vipercast coming at you on the Vipers YouTube network. You're also listening to us here on Apple, on Spotify, whatever that podcasting platform may be. Thank you for joining us, and make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let's talk about football. Let's talk about week number 7. But before we get into our starts and sits this week, we got to talk about some of the news that has broken here in the last couple days, including what is old is new again. Players who had no job opportunities here, say in the last 6 months, suddenly find themselves off the couch and back into practice fields starting this week, including Julio Jones, who inked a deal there with the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, we know that Julio Jones and A.J. Brown, they've got this little kind of mentor-mentee type relationship going, dating back to the time they're at Tennessee. Now, the last time that Julio Jones was in Tennessee playing with A.J. Brown, it didn't exactly work out. Now, here in Philadelphia, Julio Jones doesn't have to be Julio Jones. He can just sit there and be the third option in this Eagles offense. So if you're looking out there at your waivers or he's sitting there on the waiver wire, he's not a must-add player by any stretch of anyone's imagination. He's in there because they are suffering some injuries. Quez Watkins there, he's found himself on the IR. Not to mention Brett Kavoy there, Kavai, whatever you want to call him. He is not going to be an option here for Philadelphia moving forward. So the Eagles pass catchers, it's really limited right now to A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and Dallas Goedert. After that, they're just looking for bodies, warm bodies to kind of plug and play there whenever they get an opportunity to do so. Now, another player who has missed out on some opportunities here recently, and it's probably because of his Achilles injury, is James Robinson, who has signed with the Green Bay Packers. Again, much ado about nothing here in Green Bay. This is more indicative of what we've seen from Taylor there in Green Bay, which has been absolutely nothing. Emmanuel Wilson hasn't really provided anything from the RB3 position. So we are looking at an Aaron Jones who is still limited here throughout practices due to that hamstring injury, not to mention A.J. Dillon, who's been ineffective. So this run game for the Green Bay Packers, it has been obsolete. It hasn't even got a chance to get started. There's a reason why the Green Bay Packers were linked to Jonathan Taylor throughout the offseason here once he made his trade demands. That being said, James Robinson is not who he once was. In fact, he's an undrafted free agent who's had some Achilles issues. And we know that he hasn't been 100% since he's come back into the league. Now, another situation to monitor here is what's going on with the Los Angeles Rams in that backfield. And it's crazy to think that if you look at all these names who've been signed this week, the Julio Jones, the James Robinsons, the Darrell Hendersons, the Myles Gaskins, all these guys are getting signed ahead of Leonard Fournette. We're coming into playoff time here pretty soon. It's week 7. We're almost midway through the season. We need to be talking about playoff Lenny, and we haven't had the opportunity to do so, but that's where we are. Leonard Fournette, he walked into Buffalo. He had a bit of a workout. We're still waiting word to see how that translates, but we definitely know that there is a need for a big back there in Buffalo now with Damian Harris missing time. Now let's go back to this Rams backfield where I mentioned Darrell Henderson, Myles Gaskins. They activated Royce Freeman off the practice squad there to go with Zach Evans. So what does this all mean? What can we make out of this Rams backfield? Well, there's not a whole lot to make out, to be honest with you. We know that Ronnie Rivers, he's not coming back anytime soon. He may be out even longer than Williams here at this point. And we know that Williams is going to miss at least 2 weeks here, probably not coming back till after the bye. So how does this Rams backfield translate for fantasy? Well, Zach Evans should be afforded every opportunity to do so. But then again, remember Sean McVay way back when had a guy named John Kelly there who was the backup for the longest time. They pulled in some dude named C.J. Anderson off the street and gave him the lion's share of the carries. This could be one of those situations again. I don't believe anything that comes out of Sean McVay's mouth. Nothing whatsoever. Remember, he's the same Sean McVay that actually said that Cam Akers was their running back going forward here at one point during this season. That has not gone well. Cam Akers is now in Minnesota because Sean McVay put it out there into the world, and we know how that's going to work out. So right now he's saying that he's not saying that Zach Evans is going to be the running back, but he's also not giving him the first opportunity here. So this is going to be an open competition, which leads you to believe that, first off, upside, it belongs to Zach Evans. He's probably the most talented running back here in Los Angeles, but he's not the one back who knows this offense better than the rest. And that is Darrell Henderson, who's been there and done that for Sean McVay in the past. And he's had varying degrees of success in those opportunities. So I could see a situation here where Zach Evans is the number one for a day or two, but come Sunday when the snaps matter, it could go back to Darrell Henderson. And let's not forget what Myles Gaskins can do for this Rams team, because we know that when we look at pass catching ability, Myles Gaskins may be the best third down back that the Rams have right now. So you get the complete back there in Darrell Henderson, who knows this system. You've got the third down back there, Myles Gaskins, who's going to offer you some passing ability there. And you've got Zach Evans, who potentially has the most explosiveness of these three running backs. And then some dude named Royce Freeman, who just came off the practice squad, is also going to play a factor. How is that going to work out? I really don't know. I really don't want to find out. And this is one of those situations, for the most part in fantasy, I'm avoiding. I also have no problem in taking all three of these running backs and rostering them too if I have to, and see how it kind of shakes out. Zach Evans is either going to get 15 touches a game or 1 touch a game, and that's the way I'm looking at it. Now, speaking of touches, Mecole Hardman was getting no touches there in New York. Well, again, what is old is new again in Kansas City, as the Chiefs and the Jets swung a deal to bring Mecole Hardman back to Kansas City. Again, is this really fantasy news? Probably not. And finally, something that is big in the fantasy world is that the Arizona Cardinals have activated Kyler Murray off the PUP there, meaning that 21-day window is officially active. And we know when Kyler Murray is playing, he is one of the most efficient passers in fantasy that there is. We're talking about an automatic top 12 fantasy quarterback on a per game basis, year in and year out. He has finished top 12 in every single year that he's played on a per game basis. So we know right now, this is going to be one of those things that's going to absolutely boost up Marquise Hollywood Brown. More on him a little bit later, but this is one of those things that, hey, Kyler Murray, I can grab him right now. If you haven't already grabbed him, grab him, stash him, especially if you don't have one of those top 8 quarterbacks already in play. Now, going back to the week that was, let's talk about some injuries here at the key positions. Christian McCaffrey there, he's got that oblique injury. He's out 1 to 2 weeks. He could come back this week, which means Eli Mitchell or Jordan Mason may or may not have a role when this thing all shakes down here this week. We also know that David Montgomery, he's out 1 to 2 weeks, probably closer to 2 weeks, which puts him to the Detroit Lions bye. Considering that the Lions are 5-1, there's no real rush to bring David Montgomery because they've got Craig Reynolds. Or do they? Because now Craig Reynolds has popped up as a DNP here this week due to a hamstring/toe type injury. So we don't know what's going on there with the Detroit Lions in that backfield. There's going to be wide receivers who are going to have to take some reps here at running back at some point. Now, moving our attention to the quarterback position, we know that Justin Fields, he's got that thumb injury. He's probably not playing. It's not official yet, but I would not count on him playing in that game against the Raiders, because when you dislocate that thumb, you still need to try and find a way to get that grip strength back, and I don't think that's going to come this week. We also have Jimmy Garoppolo also in that Raiders-Bears matchup. He's unlikely to play due to that back injury, so we are probably going to get ourselves the beautiful matchup of Tyson Bagent and Aiden O'Connell this week. And let's not forget, Thursday Night Football, Trevor Lawrence is dealing with a knee injury that is going to limit him somewhat, which means you got to put a downgrade there on his weapons. That includes Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley. And man, Calvin Ridley versus Christian Kirk, that's for another show altogether. Now, moving around to the wide receiver position, we know that Deebo Samuel, he's day-to-day with that shoulder injury that he suffered, I think, on the first play of the game against the Minnesota Vikings. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And Alec Pierce, he's still dealing with that shoulder injury as well for the Indianapolis Colts. Now, why do we mention all these injuries? Because that's bad enough as is. But then you have to factor in that there are bye weeks this week, and there are some significant players who are on bye. We're talking about the Carolina Panthers, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Dallas Cowboys, the Houston Texans, the New York Jets, and the Tennessee Titans, all on a bye week this week, which is huge news in there for fantasy, because if you've already got 6 teams on bye and we're already dealing with the injuries we got, who can you trust in your starting lineups? Who are you supposed to be fading? Really, you can't fade anybody. If they're healthy, you're plugging them into your lineup. And I've got some lineups right now, especially the Kings Classic, that I'm plugging guys in, and I'm hoping for the best. But one player that has been the best, you don't have to worry about starting him or sitting him, because you are going to start him each and every week. It is Tyreek Hill. And surprise, surprise, I like to consider myself a pretty intelligent person when it comes to fantasy football, and I've put out some pretty good tweets in the past. This tweet this week was not even my best work, but for some reason it had gone viral. And I basically said last week that Tyreek Hill is just 186 yards shy of 1,000, and we're only in week number 6, moving into week number 7. And somehow that's my most famous tweet of all time. I don't get it, but I thank everybody for retweeting that, liking it, pushing it along the way. So thank you for all that. Now, with that all being said, let's talk about our must start and must sit players here this week. And we're going to start off with the quarterback position. So when we think about quarterbacks that I'm starting this week, I'm going to kick it off with one of my main men there, and that is Matthew Stafford. Yes, that's right. I'm going to go with Matthew Stafford this week of the Los Angeles Rams as they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we know that the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are a formidable defense. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing. But we look at what Matthew Stafford has done this season. 1,677 yards passing. He's got 6 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He's averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game. Now, he didn't exactly have a big game last week, but he still was able to hit that 15-point fantasy platform there, which is kind of like, hey, you know what? I'm okay with this. And he was let down by Puka Nacua there and Tyler Higbee, who dropped touchdown passes in that contest. So those numbers should have been a lot higher. Now he is going back here, and when we look at exactly what we're looking at, the Steelers themselves have allowed 3 of 5 quarterbacks this season. That's like, I think it was Jimmy Garoppolo, Brock Purdy in there, and CJ Stroud to score at least 20.5 fantasy points. And the way I look at the way Stafford's been playing, I don't see anyone on the Steelers defense that is going to be able to match up with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua here. So for me, Stafford is a must-start player here in week number 7. I'm also big on Jared Goff this week because maybe if this was last year, I'd be like, whoa. Jared Goff on the road. Hey, we know how those home road splits kind of work out. He is not a guy I'm going to put out there. But look, Tampa Bay, 353 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, over 26 fantasy points. He's now scored 20 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 contests. I don't care about anything else right there. I know that Jared Goff is putting up fantasy points, and it doesn't even matter who is in his lineup and who isn't in his lineup. We've seen Amon-Ra St. Brown miss time. We've seen David Montgomery miss time. Jameer Gibbs has missed time. Everyone on this line's offense has missed time, and Jared Goff just keeps on going. Now, we'll see how he fares against the Baltimore Ravens, who are basically allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game, not to mention the second fewest passing yards per game. So this is where you get a hot quarterback going against a hot defense. And for some reason, I just like the makeup of this Lions team. Some people may have Jared Goff as a sit. I got him as a start here in week 7. And another quarterback I am trusting this week is Jordan Love as he takes on the Denver Broncos. If you're playing the Denver Broncos, you're going to find your way onto my must-start list. Listen, Denver has given up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks so far this season. And if you take away that game against the Raiders, the previous 4 games, Jordan Love was actually pretty good. He was getting at least 17 fantasy points in each of those contests. So I have all the faith in the world that Jordan Love is going to be a good start this week. He's had the bye week to kind of, hey, bring it back down here a little bit. The hope here is that he's going to get Aaron Jones back. And if he gets Aaron Jones back, that is going to make this Green Bay Packers offense hit at a completely different level. Now, Denver, we talked about this. Number 1 or number 2 when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position, allowing more than 25 per game. So you basically have to look at Jordan Love here as a top 10 fantasy option here on the road in Denver. Another quarterback that I like this week is Sam Howell against the New York Giants. Now, we talked about people like, why do you got Jordan Love ranked ahead of Sam Howell? Now, listen, Sam Howell is going against the New York Giants. That is the 13th, 14th best team or worst team when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. So it is a favorable matchup. Jordan Love's got just a better matchup. That's why Jordan Love is ahead of Howell. But Howell has scored at least 21 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 contests, including the last 3 games. Now, the Giants, they have been allowing fantasy points and quarterbacks to score over 20 over the last few games as well. So if you take this math here and say, hey, the New York Giants are allowing at least 20 fantasy points per game going on here. Sam Howell is getting at least 20 fantasy points per game here. Now, I'm no mathematician or math expert, but that's telling me right now that, hey, listen, Sam Howell is probably good for 20 fantasy points this week. He's also been doing something that I've been very impressed with. He's been able to hit Terry McLaurin on the outside. So Terry McLaurin is going to have his role no matter how you want to look at it. But what he's been doing has been working the middle of the field with Logan Thomas and Curtis Samuel. which is not good news for Jahan Dotson, but hey, he's got at least 3 of his 4 weapons clicking here on all cylinders. When we look at quarterbacks that maybe I'm not quite as big on here this week, I have to look at Trevor Lawrence. Listen, the Saints, they have a good defense. They're one of the top 10, 12 teams as far as fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position so far this season. Then we have to look at the fact that Trevor Lawrence is not even clicking as a QB1 right now. I think he's QB20 as far as fantasy is concerned. So that's another knock on him. The third knock is he's dealing with that knee injury on a short turnaround week, which is going to be alarming for fantasy owners. Now, the Saints, like I mentioned, they're one of the top teams when it comes to fantasy points allowed. They've been able to basically hold opposing quarterbacks under that 17-point threshold there, which I like to consider it a good start. So I don't see how Trevor Lawrence is going to be able to get things going. The other thing here, the Saints, they've allowed 7 touchdowns this season, but they've also picked off opposing quarterbacks on 8 occasions. So we look at this, there's a good chance that Trevor Lawrence may throw a couple touchdowns, but he's also going to throw a couple picks against the Saints team. And we also know that Calvin Ridley has not been that go-to option here, and someone's going to have to go against Marshawn Lattimore, and I think that's going to be Ridley's matchup here, and I don't like that in favor of the Jaguars here. I think that's going to actually be beneficial to the Saints moving forward. Now, if this was a super flex type league or 2 QB league, yeah, okay, maybe Trevor Lawrence can get into your lineup, but right now, I like Jordan Love and I like Sam Howell just as much as I like Trevor Lawrence. And for me, the upside of those other 2 quarterbacks just is much greater than the risk that I'm willing to take on when it comes to Trevor Lawrence this week. Another quarterback that I'm just not feeling is Russell Wilson against that Green Bay Packers team. You've got one of the premier corners in the league in Jair Alexander. He's pretty much going to erase Cortland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy if Russell Wilson hasn't already erased both those guys as is. Now, if you thought that Wilson struggled against Kansas City here last week, wait till you see what he's going to go for an encore this week. Yeah, 8.9 fantasy points, not so great. I think he's even going to score fewer here against a Green Bay defense here that is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Yeah, only Desmond Ridder back in week number 2 had like 16.5 fantasy points against his Packers team. And we've watched his Packers team go against Jared Goff, Justin Fields. So there's no way you're going to find me putting Russell Wilson in any of my starting lineups this week. Another quarterback I just don't feel, it's Baker Mayfield because he's going up against Atlanta. We know Atlanta has played the quarterbacks tough. They've played the wide receivers tough. They've played pretty much everybody tough, including running backs. So we look at what Baker Mayfield's done on the season, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game. He has been an adequate starter so far. This is just one of those matchups that I'm likely to just avoid. Now, there are some definitely options out there if you're in a 2 QB league or super flex that maybe Baker Mayfield could slide into your lineup, but this is not a good thing. You know Mike Evans, he's dealing with that hamstring injury. He's not quite 100%. And if you're going against this Falcons team, you need all the offensive weapons you could possibly have. Now, another quarterback, and this is probably the biggest bust of the week, it's Kirk Cousins against the San Francisco 49ers. Cousins, 1,679 passing yards, 14 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, over 22 fantasy points per game. Just no Justin Jefferson. We saw what this offense here looked like in Minnesota without Justin Jefferson last week. It was, well, put it lightly, it was quite offensive, to be honest with you. I mean, Jordan Addison, he still had his touchdown there, but Cousins, 21 completions on 31 passes last week against a Bears team that's not very good. That's like 10.7 fantasy points or whatever you want to look at that. I mean, that's his lowest he's had all season. Again, without Justin Jefferson. He's not going to have Justin Jefferson here, and the matchup is so much tougher. He's got to deal with Nick Bosa there. We know that this 49ers team has been tough on pretty much every position in fantasy is concerned, so there's no reason for me to get out there to Kirk Cousins, and I've got to believe that there's at least 12 options out there that are better. Now, moving along to the running back position. Now, one of my favorite running backs this week that I like, it's going to be Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns because he is going against the Indianapolis Colts, and he's averaging 13 fantasy points per game, and he's got 270 yards and 3 touchdowns so far this season. And we're talking about Darrell Henderson here and Myles Gaskin and Zach Evans and Rashawn Johnson. We're talking about all these running backs out here as being startable options. Meanwhile, Jerome Ford, he's actually been a pretty good running back himself, and he's got a good game, a good matchup against the Colts here this week. We know what he's been able to do since stepping in for Nick Chubb when he was lost for the season. And he's done well in some brutal matchups, including 19 fantasy points against the Tennessee Titans, who are one of the premier run-stopping teams in the National Football League. He's also done over double digits against the San Francisco 49ers. So I have all the faith in him going against the Indianapolis Colts this week. Another running back that I probably shouldn't like as much as I do, and the matchup's not exactly what I would consider a great matchup, but it's Ramondre Stevenson against the Buffalo Bills. This Buffalo Bills team, they know how to get after the quarterback. Them and the Baltimore Ravens are tied for like the most sacks in the league at like 24 or something like that. So the best way to limit the pressure of the quarterback position is to get that screen game going, get those draws going. So we can see Stevenson being a big factor. He's coming off his best game of the season against the Las Vegas Raiders, where he scored a touchdown, put up 18 fantasy points, and maybe that is the game that he needed to turn it around. Don't forget, he had 5 catches for another 24 yards. So quietly put together a very good contest. He also averaged 13.5 fantasy points in 2 games against the Bills back in 2022. So we've seen Stevenson have success against his Buffalo defense in the past. Another running back that I'm looking to have some success with this week is Brian Robinson Jr. taking on the New York Giants. Robinson, he's got to be a top candidate for a top option here to be a top 10 fantasy back this week. We look at the backs in which the Giants have faced this year: James Conner, Christian McCaffrey, Kenneth Walker, Raheem Mostert, Devin Achan, Tony Pollard. They've scored at least 13 fantasy points per game against this Giants team. And for Johnson, he's scored at least 13 fantasy points himself in 4 of the last 6 games. So again, law of averages says if a team is giving up 13 fantasy points per game and a running back's averaging 13 fantasy points per game, then there's a good chance that said running back is going to top off at 13 fantasy points, which puts him as a very good start here in week number 7. Another running back, if you want to look for maybe a little bit of a deeper option here, how about Elijah Mitchell? Whether Christian McCaffrey plays this week or not, I don't think it's going to matter. If Christian McCaffrey does play, it is going to be limited. And the one thing that we do know about the San Francisco 49ers is they are willing to stick it out when it comes to Elijah Mitchell, whatever you want to call him, because he's been there, done that. He's been a proven commodity for the 49ers. And that's no different here. He's going to get some touches, regardless of McCaffrey being in or out of the lineup. So that's one of those things I really like moving forward here, because we know that Mitchell has had success in this offense. He has 11 games in his career in which he's got at least 13 touches, and he's averaged over 14.5 fantasy points per game as far as PPR is concerned, pardon me. Now, one of those games was way back, I think in week 12, week number 13 in 2021 against the Minnesota Vikings, where he popped off for over 27 fantasy points. So he's a guy you got to definitely keep an eye on if you're looking for that deep sleeper, because, and you know what, we just don't have very many options available to us this week. Now, on the flip side, who am I sitting? I am sitting Najee Harris. I'm so close to dropping Najee Harris. He is in a full-out 50-50 running back by committee split there with Jaylen Warren. And maybe Jaylen Warren is better back between the two. Maybe he's more explosive, or maybe it's because Jaylen Warren looks more explosive because he is fresher all the time because they run Najee Harris right to the ground. Either way, Harris hasn't scored a touchdown this season. The Pittsburgh Steelers have not a rushing touchdown this season. Heck, the Minnesota Vikings don't even have a rushing touchdown this season. So you might as well put Alexander Madison on this list, which he probably is going to make this list. But you look at this. If he's not rushing for touchdowns, then he better be catching passes. And he's not catching passes, so why is he even in the fantasy conversation right now? You cannot trust Najee Harris right now. And there's another thing working against Najee Harris. If we're hoping that he gets some passes, because he hasn't gotten any, then the addition of Deontay Johnson this week is not going to help Najee Harris's case moving forward. So for that, I am out when it comes to Najee Harris this week. Another running back that I'm just not feeling lately, it's Rachaad White here of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Coming out of the bye, like before the bye, he had about an 89% opportunity share. Now coming out of the bye, that opportunity share has somehow dropped to 58%. You're competing with Keyshawn Vaughn and Sean Tucker, a dude that's averaging like 1.7 yards per carry and another dude who's averaging 1.5 yards per carry. And yet you cannot get more of an opportunity than you have right now. That makes very little sense to me. So Rachaad White, this is a game that you better put up or shut up. And it's not a good matchup for you going against the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, I'm talking about a guy here who's averaging 10.6 fantasy points per game so far today. He's got to be one of the biggest busts so far this season. Like, how do you lose? How do you lose touches to Keyshawn Vaughn? I thought we wrote off Keyshawn Vaughn like 2 seasons ago. Anyway, I can't. I'm going to get myself all flustered, and I want to talk about more people out there. Now, when I look at the wide receivers, let's talk about wide receivers this week, because there's some wide receivers that I think you can definitely get in your lineup. I talked about him off the start of the show here, and one of my favorites, it is Marquise Hollywood Brown. Yeah, that's right. I love myself some Marquise Hollywood Brown. Why? Because he is going up against a very, very poor secondary there in the Seattle Seahawks. He was one of the most targeted wide receivers last week. I think he had 11 targets. He only caught 6 of those balls or 4 of those passes there for about 34 yards. So that's not the great part in itself. I mean, 4 catches, you don't think I'd get excited about that. But when you're facing a team like the Seattle Seahawks who are giving up the second most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and you got a wide receiver here who has 4 out of his last 5 games in which he's seen at least double-digit targets, that is screaming value to me. He's going to reward fantasy managers for sticking with him here in week number 7 against the Seattle Seahawks. You could start Marquise Hollywood Brown and feel pretty good about that. You could probably even start Michael Wilson in there. You know, Rondale Moore, fire him up there as well. If you're trying to figure out who's going to score or where those points are going to come from, it's probably going to come against this secondary of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, to their credit, they are starting to get themselves a little bit healthier here as we move along, but they are not there yet. Seattle has given up 90 receptions, 1,024 yards, and 7 touchdowns to wideouts this season. All those are within the top 7 in the NFL. Yeah, that's right. That's some pretty bad futility there, if I don't say so myself. Now, another wide receiver that I like this week is Terry McLaurin. I mentioned to him, and Sam Howell have that connection. Sam Howell seems to like to work the middle of the field, except when he's throwing to McLaurin. And McLaurin, to his defense, in 5 meetings against the Giants, he's averaging over 13 fantasy points per game, including 4 games in which he's had at least 6 catches, and 3 of those games he's had at least 105 receiving yards, not to mention a touchdown in 3 of those contests. So we know if history is going to repeat itself, then Terry McLaurin is going to have a huge week here against the Giants. So you got to make sure you got him in your starting lineup. Another wide receiver I like this week is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Yes, it does not seem right to go back to Drake London again, but you look at the numbers, and it's very hard to disagree with what he's been able to produce. Like, how do you ignore at least a 23% target share in 4 of the last 5 weeks? How do you ignore 9 catches for 125 yards against the Commanders, or a 6-catch, 78-yard performance the week before against a tough Texans secondary? You also can't ignore the fact that he's facing a Tampa Bay Buccaneers team that is allowing over 38 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And they've also allowed 5 touchdowns and 944 receiving yards to the wide receiver position in the last 5 weeks. We talk about how Drake London's fantasy value is tied into Desmond Ridder. If Desmond Ridder gives you even an okay-ish type performance, that's like a 200-300% increase of what Drake London is used to. So you can trust yourself in firing up Drake London here this week. And hey, last time that he played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he had 120 yards. So you've got that working for you as well. Now, another wide receiver that I kind of am feeling this week here a little bit, maybe if I want to dig a little bit deeper, how about Wan'Dale Robinson? He is getting that first read look there on 3rd down, which is usually a pretty good indication that you are the team's number 1 wide receiver. Now, Wednesday, we don't know if this is going to be Tyrod Taylor. We don't know if it's going to be Daniel Jones. I don't think it matters, but my personal opinion, I think it's going to be Tyrod Taylor. I think that neck is in a lot worse condition than we are being led to believe. So either way, that's going to benefit Wan'Dale Robinson this week, who's looking to build off his performance there against the Buffalo Bills, where he had 8 catches for 62 yards, all courtesy of Tyrod Taylor. So if we're looking for another stash type performance, he's a guy that I feel pretty good about, as well as Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs, who's had some pretty good performances here as of late. 4 catches and a touchdown a couple weeks ago, 4 catches last week and 70-plus yards. So the targets are coming. The opportunities are coming. The touchdowns are coming. We know the talent is there in Rashee Rice, and he's going against the Los Angeles Chargers, who, like the Seattle Seahawks, are amongst the 3 worst teams in the National Football League when it comes to giving it up to wide receivers in fantasy. So make sure you plug Rashee Rice into your lineups this week. Now, who am I sitting? I am sitting Jerry Jeudy. I'm sitting Cortland Sutton. It doesn't matter. I'm sitting both of them because Russell Wilson is an absolute fantasy killer. Let's call it the way it is. Not to mention Jair Alexander, pretty darn stingy himself. Now, Cortland Sutton, to his credit, 275 yards this year. 4 touchdowns. That is going to be appealing. So of his 25 receptions, 4 of them have been for a touchdown, and he's averaging 12.1 fantasy points per game. I just can't get behind him this week because I just think that this Green Bay Packers team is one of the best in the league when it comes to limiting fantasy opponents to very poor outings here. The Packers, they are number 7 when it comes to the fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. And we talked about how Jair Alexander is a difference maker. They have basically erased DJ Moore earlier this season, held him to 4.5 fantasy points. And then they also held Devontae Adams, I believe, to about 8.5 fantasy points back in week 5. So we know that this is not good. I'm not saying Courtland Sutton's a bad receiver. I'm just saying he's definitely not DJ Moore, and he sure the hell ain't Devontae Adams. Another wide receiver I'm seeing this week, it's got to be George Pickens. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because I don't really like George Pickens, to be honest with you. Everything was all sunshine and rainbows a couple weeks ago where he scored a touchdown on that 41-yard pass, had 130-plus yards receiving against the Ravens. So everyone was like, hey, George Pickens is here to go. But listen, this Rams team is tough on receivers. They've held him to a single touchdown so far this season. They're allowing just 26.73 fantasy points per game. And you also have to figure out that Kenny Pickett, he ain't going to like a whole lot of Aaron Donald coming in his way. So what's the best way to contain Aaron Donald? Well, it's not by passing to Najee Harris, because we know that's not going to work. It's to throw the ball to Deontay Johnson, which is going to limit George Pickens' opportunities. Whew. That's a lot of talking here already. So what else do I got for you? Well, you know what? When we keep our looking around here at some other wide receivers that we are going to sit, it's got to be one of my biggest bust potentials here. And this one hurts because I really believe in the Gardner Minshew, Michael Pittman type connection here. But I also believe in is that the Cleveland Browns are pretty darn tough when it comes to wide receivers. No team is allowing fewer receiving yards per game than the Cleveland Browns. No team is allowing wide receivers to fewer fantasy points per game than the Cleveland Browns. And I know you're not going to want to bench Michael Pittman, so this is more of a buyer beware because the Cleveland Browns are that good. They eliminated Brandon Ayuk there just a couple weeks ago. He had a couple of big catches there late in that contest, but they still held him to under 12 fantasy points that day. They've also had matchups against Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, DeAndre Hopkins, Zay Flowers. These are all wide receivers that they've shut down for the most part this season. So, hey, if you're going to play Pittman, just understand that he is a low-end, probably wide receiver 3 this week and one of the more volatile options that you can be running out there. Now, turning your attention to the tight end position, who am I starting? Hey, as crazy as it was for me to start Drake London, I'm also firing up Kyle Pitts this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Yeah, that's right. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they might rank 10th or 9th or whatever you want to call it against the tight end position here. But Pitts, maybe he's got it going here. Maybe this is a time that we can start believing in him once again. I don't know what it is, but when I look at the targets here and everything that he's been doing over the last 2 games against the Texans and the Commanders there, he has 11 catches for 130 yards. He has a touchdown there. And more importantly, in those 2 games, 17 targets. And that's what I'm looking at. That is hard to ignore. Now, we know that Desmond Ridder throws a lot of passes there from time to time, and 90% of them are usually deemed uncatchable. But these targets are starting to hit their receivers, then there's some fantasy value to be had. Another tight end that I like this week, it's going to be Michael Mayer of the Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Chicago Bears because, quite frankly, Chicago, I don't like this defense. I don't think they're good. I think they're overrated here the last couple of weeks. And Meyer is coming off one of his biggest games of his career there, a 5-catch, 75-yard performance against the New England Patriots last week. That being said, listen, I don't think that Tremaine Edmonds is who he once was. I don't think TJ Edwards is who he once was. And I don't think either one of those linebackers can match up with Michael Mayer here in October. Like, we're talking, he's not Michael Myers, but Michael Myers, yeah, he's going to be pretty tough to defend here, especially just after Friday the 13th. So that's something to also keep in mind. He is definitely worthy of being a tight end 1 this week. I think he's going to produce as a tight end 1. And another tight end that I like to be a tight end 1 this week is Pat Freiermuth. Now, he is coming off the injury report there. He missed some time there dealing with that hamstring injury prior to the Steelers' Week 5 bye. So he's a guy that you're going to be kind of monitoring, but when he's healthy, he's been averaging 6.3 fantasy points per game so far this season. He's got 2 touchdowns, and you know what? This is one of those games that you're like, this is one of those make-right games. The Rams are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends, and I mean, literally, Andrew Ogletree, Mo Alley Cox, these are guys who've had some varying degrees of success against this Rams team. So for me, I feel pretty darn good about firing up Pat Fairmouth, knowing that a guy named Andrew Ogletree was able to score 10 fantasy points against him. So feel good about yourself there. Again, Logan Thomas, he's another one of those tight ends. I got him about tight end 12, tight end 13 this week. So you can fire him up there. He's averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game. One thing that Thomas has done very well is he's scored at least 10 fantasy points per game in 2 of his previous 3 contests and had 9 catches for 77 yards and a touchdown on 11 targets against the Bears back in week 5. So we know that Sam Howell has been looking for him most of the season. Now, as far as sits are concerned, I am sitting Hunter Henry. The dude was in and out of that lineup last week with that ankle injury. I don't think it's going to be ready to go this week against the Buffalo Bills. And the Buffalo Bills have been one of the more tough teams when it comes to defending tight ends so far this season, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position. Who else am I sitting at the tight end position? Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett is one of those guys who's a matchup-based tight end, and this is not a matchup that you want to base any tight end in against the Kansas City Chiefs. Sure, we're going to have some fireworks, but it's going to be compliments of Keenan Allen, Joshua Palmer potentially. I mean, if anyone's going to get some points here, it's going to be on the outside. It's not going to happen inside. We've got some tough defenders there for the Kansas City Chiefs in both Gay and Bolton here. So those are both tough matchups there for a wide tight end to have some success. And probably the biggest bust potential of the tight end position is going to be Zach Ertz. He had one good week back in week number 5 against Cincinnati Bengals. And since then, he has struggled. And now he gets to go against and this is struggling. He struggled against a Rams team that is one of the worst in the league. Now he has to go against one of the best teams at defending the tight end here this week in the Seattle Seahawks. I don't like this matchup for him one way, shape, or another. Like literally, you had 2 games against the Bengals and Rams, and you come away with just 4 catches for 32 yards. Sure, you had 9 targets, but I still need you to catch the ball. You have to come down with it. And this Seattle Seahawks team has yet to allow a tight end into the end zone so far this season. And they went up against one of the best in the league here in Sam Laporta, and they kept him under 8 fantasy points. So that's one of those matchups that I just don't like heading all when you look at these matchups, that's one I'm looking to avoid altogether. And of course, another tight end that I'm fading, maybe not avoiding altogether. It's going to be Sam Laporta against the Baltimore Ravens because, again, that Baltimore Ravens team is as good as anyone when it comes to defending the position. Now, I know you're not going to sit Sam Laporta. You probably feel that you can't afford to sit Sam Laporta, and you know what? You're probably not wrong. But look, I'm going to just kind of make a case for why Sam Laporta should probably be sitting this week. On the season, Baltimore themselves, like the Seattle Seahawks, have not allowed a tight end to find the end zone, and they've held tight ends to just 151 yards receiving on just 22 receptions. Now, Sam Laporta, he's not like any other tight end, so maybe he can avoid this whole thing, but I'd be worried that his production could be minimalized here this week. When we look at what Laporta did last week, he had that calf injury. Again, that calf injury is still going to be there. He's still dealing with that soft tissue kind of thing going on there. 4 catches, 36 yards. I just don't like it. Baltimore overall is only allowing 126 yards per game over the last 3 weeks, which is going to complicate things even further, especially when you're trying to get someone like Sam Laporta into your lineup. So he's another guy I'm looking to fade. Now, if you're into DST and stuff like that, talk about defense, here's a few teams that I think that maybe you could be interested in here. When I take a look at my weekly rankings, I look over the DST, we know that the Buffalo Bills, Cleveland Browns, San Francisco 49ers, Kansas City Chiefs, these are all teams that you're going to start each and every week for the most part for DST. Now, I'm also going to be looking at the Las Vegas Raiders. They're my number 5 ranked team here for defense. The Pittsburgh Steelers coming at 6, the Washington Commanders coming at 7, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming at 8, and the New Orleans Saints coming at number 9. So if you're streaming defenses, those are a handful of teams that I think you could stream here this week. And I like the Raiders as one of my top streaming options for week number 7. With that all being said, hey, make sure you head over to the YouTube channel, catch all our latest videos. Make sure you're catching us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you can find us. You can catch Tara, Miss Fantasy there with Roto Underworld, doing some stuff with Bleacher Report, CBS Sports. You can catch myself doing stuff with Roto Baller and Fantasy Points as well. So make sure to tune in everywhere the fantasy is, and make sure to check me out here on Twitter at Matt Donnelly FF, and we'll see you next week.